As I said as we began our service, now we're going to have a conversation with David Graham about what's going on in Israel. I'm really delighted. Not only is David a wonderful past president of our congregation, but very learned and knowledgeable about what's going on in Israel. And because one of the major things that Israel is facing now is a proposed judicial reform, I thought it also was important to have a lawyer and somebody who understood these things better than I did to be in conversation with. So thank you, David, for being here. And I think we're just going to move the chairs up just a little bit, David, a little closer. And then I have a microphone for you. So people can see us a little better.
Good evening, everyone.
Is it on? No.
Try this? No?
Just takes another second to go on. There you go.
Try that.
Yeah,
there we
we
go.
go.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. And I'm honored to be able to have this conversation with Rabbi London about her trip to Israel and some of the events that are going on. The rabbi optimistically said that this will last a half an hour, maybe. But don't be surprised if, in the interests of hearing more from the rabbi, we go a few minutes over. So I wanted to start, before we plunge into your trip and your takeaways, Rabbi, I wanted to give a little bit of framing for what it is that's been occurring in Israel, because I think that's important in terms of understanding some of what's going on for purposes of our conversation. And let's start with, Rabbi, the most recent election, which occurred in November of 2022. And that was, as many of you know, it was the fifth election that had been held in Israel over the past 4 or so years. Each time that a government was elected, it was unstable, unable to maintain a coalition, and the recent governments, in fact, have been called unity governments, which were uneasy coalitions of kind of center-right and center-left parties that ultimately fell apart. And this time, in November of 22, we got a new government with Netanyahu now being the prime minister and having a coalition with a majority of 64 out of 120 members of parliament being part of that coalition. So, Rabbi, what's different about this coalition as opposed to earlier coalitions, including earlier coalitions headed by Netanyahu when he's been prime minister at earlier times?
Well, as you noted, David, the previous coalitions had people from across the spectrum of political opinion, and so the last coalition had people from the center, from center-left parties, and actually also had there's a coalition of Arab parties who were also part of the government, and it made the government, as you noted, unstable and difficult to govern, and they couldn't really get very much done, but at the same time, you didn't have a one voice that was louder than the other in some ways. There was also going to be a switch in terms of prime minister, and so you had a prime minister from the right party, you had a prime minister who was going to switch to the left party, but unfortunately the government also couldn't sustain itself. Not only could it not do very much, but it couldn't sustain itself, and after a year and a half it collapsed, and so they needed to go into elections again, the fifth election in 4 years. And this government this time, instead, Netanyahu put together a coalition, as he noted, of 64 people, and all of the people in that coalition are to the right. And there's never been a government in the history of the State of Israel that has been as far right-wing as the current government. It's really exceptional in that kind of way. Let me just give you a little sense about some of the people who are in the government to understand, and some of you who might be keeping up on this might have heard about them. Bezalel Smotrich, Minister of Finance from the Tzionut Hadatit Party, the religious Zionist party. Salo Smotrich has said, "It's a mistake that Ben-Gurion didn't finish the job and didn't throw you out in 1948 in relationship to the Palestinian people. He also called himself a fascist homophobe." Somebody else didn't call him that, that's what he called himself. Recently, when he was in France, he called the Palestinians an invented people. And when I was in Israel, there was a rampaging of an Arab village in the Shomron, the northern part of the West Bank, just about 10 miles, or 10 kilometers, I should say, south of Nablus, called Hawara. And after a couple of settlers had been killed by somebody within the village, the nearby settlement of Yitzhar sent people in, and they started burning the village. And afterwards, Smotrich said, citizens shouldn't be doing this. The government should have wiped out Hawara. And then, while I was also in Israel, on February 23rd, the defense minister signed an agreement assigning governmental powers in the West Bank to a body to be headed by Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who is now effectively the governor of the West Bank, controlling almost all areas of life there, including planning, building, and infrastructure. Israeli governments have, up to this point, been careful to keep the occupation as a military government, and now, with Smotrich as being the governor of the West Bank, it's de jure annexation. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Minister of National Security. He has a responsibility to oversee the Israel police, the Israel border police in the West Bank. He's part of the Otzma Yehudit Party, the Jewish Power Party, which is a rebirth of Meir Kahana's party. Ben-Gvir has faced charges of hate speech against Arabs and was known to have a portrait in his living room of Israeli-American terrorist Baruch Goldstein. That name might sound familiar to you because in 1994, Baruch Goldstein massacred 29 Palestinian Muslim worshippers of prayer and wounded another 125 in Hebron in the Cave of the Patriarchs, Cave of Machpelah. Ben-Gvir did remove the portrait of Baruch Goldstein after he went into politics, but we know where his politics lie. Itamar Ben-Gvir was also previously convicted of supporting a terrorist group known as Kach, which is the Kahana organization. Under his leadership, the Otzma Yehudit Party espouses Kahanism and anti-Arabism. He won all of 6 seats in the Knesset. And this is also something that's important to understand, is because it's a coalition government, people who have not a lot of support, perhaps about maybe 5% of the country, 5 to 10% of the country, are able to gain a lot of power because Netanyahu has to convince them to join the coalition. In order to do so, he will give away goodies to them, like putting Ben-Gvir in charge of security. He has called for the expulsion of Arab citizens of Israel who are not loyal to Israel. As a lawyer, he is known for defending Jewish radicals on trial. He's also been accused of being a provocateur, having previously led several visits to the Temple Mount as activist and member of Knesset, contentious marches through Jerusalem's Old City Muslim quarter, and set up an office in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, which is in East Jerusalem, kind of in the north of the city there, in order to provoke the population there. Avi Maoz, from the Noam Party, there's 1 seat that he has, which means that he had to earn 3.25% of the vote to get into power. But in order to get him into the coalition, he has said, and this is Avi Maoz has said, that he thinks that there should only be a far-right interpretation of Orthodox Judaism, and he has lobbied against secularism and Reform Judaism. He has campaigned heavily against LGBTQ rights, calling for a ban on pride parades and the legalization of conversion therapy. He is against women serving in the Israel Defense Forces and has called for increased gender segregation in public events. So this just gives you a sense of some of the people who are in the government.
So, just to sort of put a cap on all that, Rabbi, if I'm correct, my understanding is that of the 64 members of the coalition, 32, exactly 1/2, but clearly the predominant, are members of the far-right religious parties in Israel, which is an unprecedented situation in terms of the governing coalition. So now let's talk a little bit about, or more than a little bit, about some of the prominent items for the agenda of the Netanyahu coalition and the ones that have received the most attention. We don't have time to cover the range of what, so we're just going to touch on the ones that I think have been most in the public eye. And we're going to start with the one that I think most of you may have heard of, and that's the proposed judicial reforms, changes in the judicial system in Israel. And in order to help understand what some of the debate may be about and some of the background, I'm going to give a little background about the Israeli legal system, because it's quite different than our legal system. In 1948, when the Declaration of Independence was passed in Israel, the Declaration envisioned that there would be elections to a constitutional assembly that, like our constitutional convention, would put together a constitution. But it never happened. Instead, when the assembly got together, they formed a parliament, what became the Knesset. And they decided, rather than adopting a constitution at a single point in time, they would bit by bit adopt pieces of a constitution over time. The pieces of the Constitution being known as basic laws. And so from the outset, there was no constitution in Israel. Instead, you had a series of basic laws. And until 1992, there were some basic laws, but none of them had anything to do with what we would think of as being civil rights or human rights, other than the right to vote. In 1992, that changed. There were two basic laws that were adopted, which were aimed at protecting human rights. One was the Basic Law regarding freedom of occupation, and the other was called the Basic Law regarding human dignity and liberty. Now, you may ask, what's the difference between the Knesset just passing a piece of legislation and the Knesset passing a quote-unquote basic law, which is part of the Israeli Constitution? And the answer is, there's not much of a difference. In the United States, we think about passing a constitution or a constitutional amendment as something that requires, a supermajority within the Congress, and then 2/3 of the states have to approve, 3/4 of the states have to approve the amendment in order for it to pass. That's not the way it works in Israel. For a basic law, part of the Constitution to be passed, all that it requires is 61 members out of the 120 in Parliament to pass the law. And to revoke a basic law, all that it requires is 61 members out of the 120. So what's the difference between normal legislation and constitutional legislation, you may ask? Very good question. And in 1995, the Israeli Supreme Court made a ruling which kind of ushered in the constitutional revolution, where they said, because there was a great deal of uncertainty about this in Israel, they said, even though you can pass a basic law the same way you pass a piece of legislation, basic laws are different. They're superior in nature. They trump, so to say. So that in the United States, if you were to pass a piece of legislation on day one, pass another piece on day two, and something in the second piece of legislation contradicted the first, the most recent one would win out. What they said, the Supreme Court said, is if you pass a basic law on day one, and you pass a piece of legislation on day two, and there's some conflict, the piece of legislation does not win out, even though you had 61 members voting for it in the Parliament. And that ushered in what's known as the constitutional revolution, between the adoption of the two basic laws addressing human rights and the Supreme Court ruling in 1995. Up until that time, there was basically no law in Israel for purposes of enforcing human rights at the constitutional level. So now what's changed, and what are the proposals? The proposals by the ruling coalition to change the judicial system are, there are different iterations, but there are four that I'll mention briefly. One is a proposal that any judicial rulings that strike down a law as being unconstitutional or improper can be overturned by the Knesset by a vote of 61 members. In a sense, that's a return to the way that things were before. It says that the ultimate authority in the state resides with the parliament, closer to a British system, and less so with a constitutional democracy. So they're saying we want to be able to have, if the court rules and we think the court is wrong in striking down a piece of legislation, if we can muster 61, that we should be overturned that. The second ruling, the second proposal that's on the table is, remember I talked about basic laws being kind of constitutional? Well, there's an undecided issue within Israeli law, and that is, can the Supreme Court actually declare a basic law to be unconstitutional and strike down the basic law as being against sort of the principles of the Israeli state, those two fundamental principles being that it's both Jewish and democratic. The Supreme Court has never struck down a basic law as itself being unconstitutional. Think about that, because what's involved in that, that would be the equivalent of if our Supreme Court, if there were a constitutional amendment, and our Supreme Court were to say that that constitutional amendment was itself unconstitutional, where would the authority or basis for that come from? And so they've asked that the Supreme Court not be able to declare a basic law unconstitutional. Why is that important? Because remember, basic laws can be passed with just 61 votes in terms of this. And there's a substantial body of opinion in Israel currently that if the current proposals go through, even in the form of a basic law, that the Supreme Court may in fact step in and overturn all of these legislative proposals as being unconstitutional. The third reform that is being proposed with regard to the Supreme Court is the way that the Supreme Court justices are selected. Currently, the Supreme Court justices are in essence nominated and then confirmed. They're nominated by a committee, and the committee consists of representatives from the Knesset on both sides of both the opposition and the ruling coalition, but it also consists of members of the bar associations, and it also consists of members of the Supreme Court itself, all of which have to reach a recommendation as to who's going to be nominated. And what the Netanyahu coalition has proposed is basically a series of steps that would make it that the ruling coalition, whoever has the majority control, would be able to put in place new Supreme Court justices just on the basis of their ruling majority. Now, that's been accused of being anti-democratic, but just to remind you, that is precisely our system in the United States, where, of course, the ruling party in the Senate either votes to confirm or not to confirm a given Supreme Court nominee to the bench, as we know all too well. Finally,
it doesn't always work all too well.
It does not work always too well. Finally, the Supreme Court in Israel utilizes a standard of review, which has come under criticism from various quarters, which I'll call proportionality or reasonableness review. And that is, what they say is, if there's an issue that arises as to whether a law is infringing certain rights, we will conduct our own balance to see whether or not the social goods arising from that law outweigh the social harms. And what we determine to be reasonable in that regard will determine whether the law survives or not. And various criticisms have been made that that's too loosey-goosey of a standard. It replaces the legislature with the Supreme Court as doing a balancing act that they shouldn't do. These should be familiar criticisms to those of us in the United States who watch the Supreme Court. And so other set of proposals is to strip reasonableness away. Now, as I've indicated, some of these proposals, even though they've been turned anti-democratic, could actually be defended as being democratic, at least in terms of our understandings in the U.S. But there's a risk of losing the forest for the trees here in terms of what the purpose of these proposals is and what the end result. Because the end result would be that there would be no protection for minorities in Israel that could not be overridden by a simple majority of whatever the ruling coalition is. That's kind of the game plan, and you don't need all four of these in order to get there. Even if you have one or two of them, it's more than sufficient to get there, including just the ability to appoint the Supreme Court justices. So you have to take things in context. And I apologize for that lengthy explanation, but now let me ask you a couple of questions, Rabbi. Having spent time in Israel and talked to people about this, and this is, obviously a paramount issue, were those with whom you spent time shocked, and if so, why, by these proposals?
Well, it really depends on who I was spending time with. People who have been watching what's been happening in Israel and have watched the slide to this liberalism were not so surprised, and people who had, assumed that Israel was much more of a liberal democracy were much more shocked. I would compare it to when, when Trump was elected here, that, there were some people, especially minorities in this country, who were not at all surprised at the hate that was unearthed at that time. But those who, are in our society who hadn't experienced that kind of discrimination, they were much more shocked about Trump coming to power. And I would say the same thing that is happening here, is that people really who have been discriminated against, who've been watching it, were less shocked to see what has happened. It's much more that this coalition kind of unearthed what has been going on below the surface in Israel. And for those people who really hadn't been paying attention, they all of a sudden they woke up and said, oh my goodness, our rights could be taken away. And I think that's what's really kind of shocking right now. It's happening in Israel. It's not like they're just people who've been watching the government or people who are lefties who are out in the street. It is many, people, much more centrists in Israel, who are out protesting week after week after week. I was there for 2 weeks. I went to 3 protests in 2 weeks. The first day I was there was a protest at the Knesset. It was during the day. And then after that, there was 2 Saturday night protests in Tel Aviv. And the first Saturday night protest was during my conference. I was there with a group of Reform rabbis. There were 250 rabbis there. And the head of our movement, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, spoke at that protest. And he's the only American who's spoken at the protest, and he spoke in Hebrew, and he really did us proud. I mean, he was Reform rabbis. I think we were really excited to see him up there speaking. But a member of Knesset, who's also a Reform rabbi, a colleague of mine, his name is Gilad Kariv. He is a rabbi, and he's a lawyer, and he's a member of Knesset in the Labor Party. And of course, he spoke to our conference, and he's very concerned about what he sees, and has really encouraged all of us as Reform rabbis to go home and to tell people about what's happening and to make sure that we are standing up for against these proposals. Many people are not calling it, just an overhaul, but really a revolution, and people are very scared and nervous about what it will mean for human rights.
So, Rabbi, you anticipated a question that I was going to ask, but I want to follow up on a comment you made. You analogized what's going on in Israel with the proposed judicial overhaul to some of what occurred in the United States, in the sense that while some of what had been present in the United States may have been more apparent to minority and other groups, that it perhaps laid bare what was beneath the surface in a way that caused others to wake up to it. So I guess I have that same question as to Israel, and perhaps provocatively. What's happening now, does this represent a fundamental shift in Israeli democracy, or are we simply laying bare failings that have been pre-existing the democracy, but which now threaten to become more widespread?
I think it's the latter. I think that there have been these failures in the Israeli democracy that have been laid bare. there are, some people who I spoke with who have been working for, many years against the military occupation of the West Bank, and have talked about how that is continuing to slide Israel into being in a liberal democracy, ruling over people who don't have equal rights, and not being able to resolve the conflict. And one person that I spoke to, who there's also been an argument in what's been happening in the streets of how much do you talk about what's happening in terms of the military occupation of the West Bank, and how much you just talk about the judicial reforms. And many people feel like we shouldn't be talking about the occupation or the Palestinians because it's not going to bring together the largest coalition of people. That if we start talking about the occupation, that only people who are further to the left are really going to be willing to come out in the streets, and we want to create the largest coalition possible. And so because of that, there's been even an argument at the rallies in terms of what kinds of voices and who should be speaking. Although I have to say that after the rampage in Hawara, that all of the Israeli press, by the way, called it a pogrom. There was the Israeli press was pretty clear about what they called what happened in Hawara. That they said, you have these settlers who came in a rampage, and you had the IDF and you had the border police who didn't stop what was going on, and so people were really shaken by that in Israel, really shaken the next day. People were just outraged that could happen, and then when Smotrich came out and said, we shouldn't have civilians doing this, that we should have done this, the shock and horror of so many Israelis was really palpable. Our best friends in Israel live in Givatayim, and they're a Yemenite and Moroccan couple. And I would say that they're pretty centrist Israelis, have raised their children, their grandchildren, of course served in the army, and they're out in the street every week. And they just can't believe, they just absolutely can't believe what's happening in Israel, and they are they're really horrified. And their eldest grandchild is supposed to be enlisting in the IDF coming this summer, and there's a lot of people asking a lot of really hard questions right now.
So we obviously, you just touched on another area of the agenda that I wanted to have us talk about, or at least acknowledge a little bit. Part of it is the judicial overhaul, but as you just said, another part of it is the occupation and the West Bank. And just to bring people up to speed in that regard, this week the Knesset approved legislation that overturns a 2005, what was called the 2005 disengagement law, and permits settlers to return to areas of the West Bank that were evacuated in 2005 as part of Israel's withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. And that comes on top of the government having announced its intention to legalize 9 West Bank settler outposts, which is also in direct disregard of promises previously made to the international community, including the United States government, which has led to various protests. But let's talk about Hawara for a second. You visited Hawara. What are your, what is your takeaway in terms of the path that we are headed on with the current coalition government in terms of the occupation of the West Bank and the violence that's occurring?
Well, a lot to say about that, but and I think it's really important to understand that the law that removed those settlements in 2005 from the Shomron, from the northern part of the West Bank, was the same one that made the settlers of Gaza leave. And there are many people who believe that the reason this judicial overhaul is being proposed by so many people in the right-wing government is that they have been angry since the 2005 disengagement, and they felt that the Supreme Court didn't protect them, and that was a reason that they had to be evacuated from all of these settlements. And that since then, that the right wing has been trying to figure out how to get back to Gaza and how to get back to these settlements in the West Bank. There's another woman who's in the government who has come out on television and said, "We're going back to Gaza. we're going to go resettle Gaza, and that this judicial overhaul was really about permitting settlers to go back to settlements and making sure that the settlements would never be uprooted. So what happened in Hawara? As I said, there's a settlement that's right next to Hawara, and two people from the settlement came into Hawara, and they were murdered there. Hawara is a fairly decent-sized town, and it's right near the settlement, and so it's very common for the settlers to come in and to go shopping there. And they were murdered, which was, is horrible and despicable, but it doesn't give. It doesn't give the right, for the settlers to come in and say, oh, because two people were killed, we're just going to burn down your village. And the pictures on Israeli television were just horrible of, all these homes that were burning and somebody was killed, and there were also vehicles that were burned as well. And so it really changed the tenor of the protest. So the protest the first night that I was in Tel Aviv was before Hawara, and then afterwards was the week after Hawara. And all of a sudden, the anti-occupation parts of that protest were much stronger, and people were much more tolerant, because I think people were just so shocked and horrified by what happened in Hawara. And then I found out that this group that I've been part of, called Standing Together, in Hebrew it's called Omdim B'Yachad, and it's Jews and Arabs who've been working to create a better shared civil society within Israel. They decided that they were going to have a solidarity mission that was going to go out to Hawara. And I'd met with one of the leaders the day before, and I said, I'd like to join you out there, and he told me where to meet the bus. And so we drove out there, and there was about 5 buses that came, and we go past the settlement of Ariel, and then we're supposed to go turn up north to the road to get to Hawara, and the IDF stopped us there, and they told us that the buses couldn't go through, that it was a closed military zone. Well, it was not a closed military zone, because every other car that came by was allowed to go through, settlers, Palestinians, but they didn't want us to go through. So we got down off the buses, and we started to walk towards Hawara, and then the soldiers came out and they said, well, you can't go in. And, these were all Israelis that I was with. And these were very prominent Israelis that we went out there with. There was a former speaker of the Knesset who was with us, Avram Berg. I happened to just sit down on the bus. I didn't know. I got on the bus with all the Israelis, and I was like, and who are you? And someone introduces herself. She's a prominent filmmaker in Israel, married to a prominent author, and, the daughter of one of the most famous singers in Israel. She's sitting on the bus there. And I said, what? And with me, and I was like, I was almost embarrassed, and I didn't recognize her though. And I said, why are you here? And she said, well, I feel like I have to. What has happened here is just outrageous and horrible. So it was very prominent people who came to go out to Hawara, and we were invited actually by the people of the town. We weren't just going to appear. We were invited to come and to show that our solidarity with them, and we were horrified by what had happened. And then as we got close to Hawara, the soldiers started saying, you can't go in. And the Israelis, and these are everyone who served in the army, and they're all asking them, where is your orders? Where is your orders? Because they know that without orders, we should be able to walk. We're just going to visit people. It wasn't even supposed to be a protest. We were just going to go in and visit people. And then they started, linking hands with each other, and they said, you can't go. And people kept saying, yes, we can go. You have no orders to stop us. We're going to continue walking. And we continued walking. And then it got a little hairy, and they started pushing people, including Avram Berg, who's, as I said, former speaker of the Knesset, man who's like 70 years old, and he's getting harassed. Alon Lee Green, who actually sat one of these chairs on this bima a year ago, who was one of the leaders of Standing Together, was also harassed at that moment. And they kept saying, just keep walking, and we kept walking. And then the soldiers started throwing stun grenades at us. And it was pretty shocking. Stun grenades were very loud, and the purpose is to scatter a protest. And then we ended up walking back. And as we were walking back, there was some settlers who stopped in a car, and they wanted to talk to us. And at that time, I was walking with a man who is the head of the Abraham Initiative, which is, again, Jews and Palestinians within Israel. We're sending, Palestinians to Brandeis University and doing other kinds of work together as Jews and Palestinians. And I was walking with him, and I was chatting with him, and these women stopped us, and they wanted to chat. And they wanted to know what we were doing, and we told them why we were there. And then this woman the driver turns to him and says, Mi ha'achim shalechem? Who are your brothers? Who are your brothers? Who? And And he turns back to them and says, "Kulam nivru b'tzelem." All of us were created in the image of God. And it was just this moment of the difference between the settlers there in the West Bank who believe we have to watch out for Jews first and foremost, and someone who has a more universal notion that all of us are created in God's image. All of us deserve the right to dignity and to human rights and to equality. And this is really where the difference is in Israeli society. And this is exactly what's happening, is what is happening in Israel is, are we going to follow what's written in the Declaration of Independence, which says that Israel, yes, is going to be a Jewish state, but is going to guarantee the rights of everybody, gay and lesbian and Arab and whatever background you come from, or are we going to be a theocratic state? And I think this is what people are really scared of in Israel, is that people see Israel sliding into being a theocracy. You know.
So, too many questions, too little time. On that score, you've mentioned the protests, and I gather that, Rabbi, you find the protests that are occurring in Israel now to be different in maybe their prolonged nature and who's pouring out in the streets than others that have occurred in the past. Can you talk about that a little bit, including talking about what's happening with the reservists who are going on strike? And I'll also mention that in connection with that there have been recent threats by the Israeli defense minister to resign the position unless the judicial overhaul is put on ice because of what's happening with the reservists in Israel. So talk a little bit about the role of the military in the protests and how that affects things.
Well, of course, I think everybody knows that everybody in Israel is required to serve in the military, men and women, Orthodox and non. There are exceptions to people who don't serve. There are many in the ultra-Orthodox community who don't serve. They're given many exceptions, which bothers a lot of people in Israeli society, but that's the reality. And those who are Palestinian also do not serve, even though technically the law would require them to serve. That's been the practice in Israel. But it is in many ways a great equalizer because almost everybody else does serve. And not only do you serve for 2 years if you're female and 3 years if you're male, but then after that you serve in what's known as miluim, you're a reservist and you keep going back. And so what happened while I was there is that there were the pilots that are the most prominent in the military. There are many of them who said that they wouldn't serve. And then other prominent units have also come out and saying we will not serve in the reserves. That what the state has promised us is that we're going to be a liberal democracy, and if we're not going to do that, then the state has broken its contract with us. And that's actually the language that's been used at some of the protests, because some of these prominent military people have actually spoken at the protests and have said this. And then, you also have the high-tech folks who are also very worried about what's happening. I was listening today to a webinar, Guy Rolnick, who started the most prominent financial paper in Israel called The Market? I just had a moment of forgetting the name of the paper. Anyway, he's also a professor here at the University of Chicago at the Booth School, and he was talking about the high-tech sector as people are getting skittish, and there's concern that people are going to start pulling their money out. There's one high-tech company while I was there that told its employees that if they wanted to move to Lisbon, they could. Because apparently in Portugal you can easily get citizenship, and that they could work from there. And so I think that there's really a fear that if several things happen, that if the high-tech sector and the reservists are all going to protest, and you're getting hundreds of thousands of people out in the street, that will be maybe what turns what's happening.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems that Israel is at a potential inflection point. And on one side of that inflection point is the threat, as you put it, of sort of a theocracy that has a very narrow vision of what a Jewish state would be, but that the hopeful side of that inflection point is that you may actually get large portions of the society that are rallying together in a way they haven't been because they perceive a need for action in the face of a threat that's been latent but is now more express.
Yeah, and I think that that was the hopeful side that I saw. I would say that actually going to the protests was actually a lot of fun, very joyful, that people were in the streets, people are carrying Israeli flags, and people were standing up and saying, this is what it means to be patriotic today. This is what I want to do in Israel. I've served my country, and this is patriotism today. And I really felt that. The friends that we were with, he had served in 73 during the Yom Kippur War, and we bumped into another man who was holding a sign that he had served in the Yom Kippur War, and I got this beautiful picture of the two of them and how they connected. And they said, we served our country by fighting in its war, and this is the way that we're serving the country now. And so I did really see that hopefulness too, that people really feel like this is what it means to be in a democracy, is that when things are feeling threatened, that you need to get out in the streets, that you need to do whatever you can to make sure that your society doesn't, slide into a theocracy. And so that was definitely very hopeful in terms of what I saw.
One last set of questions. Do U.S. Jews or diaspora Jews in general have skin in the game here? Or is this a matter of internal Israeli politics that by and large we should stay out of? And should U.S. Jews, like their Israeli counterparts, be protesting in the streets not by the dozens, but by the tens or hundreds of thousands?
Well, if we were going to protest in the same number, we'd have to get 20 million people into the streets. That's what they're saying, is 500,000 Israelis is like 20 million Americans. Can you imagine 20 million Americans taking to the streets? If we got the entire Jewish community in this country, we wouldn't have 20 million Americans. So we wouldn't have 20 million Jews. We'd have to get a lot of other non-Jews to join us. So we have to get 100% of our community plus many others. But yes, of course we have skin in the game. First of all, as I mentioned, that one of the ministers in the government has clearly said, that Reform Jews should be considered second-class citizens, and that he's also talking about there have been laws to propose that those who've been converted by Reform rabbis won't be considered Jewish for the law of return. There had been a big fight in which finally we were able to get our converts to be considered Jewish for the law of return, and now he wants to overturn that. And so there are things that really do affect us and affect us as American Jews, and I think it's important for us to understand that that is one way personally that we are affected by this. But also, and listen, Netanyahu's even said this himself, if Israel is supposed to be the state of the Jewish people wherever they live, then we should have some influence about what the character of that state is going to be. And finally, I'll tell you that my Israeli friends are begging me, do not be quiet. Please do not be quiet. I'm on a listserv now of Israelis who live in the United States, and it's called USA for Israeli Democracy. And they're begging us, please write letters to Biden and tell him that he needs to intervene. Please get on the street. Please be out there protesting. So we've started protests here. Actually, the protests in Chicago are happening here in Evanston in Fountain Square because they're being organized by my cousin, and I've been helping her with those protests. And last week we had a few people out there. Let's see, Mark and Wendy were there. What did we get, 30 people out there? So 30 people have been showing up to the protests. In New York, they've been getting hundreds of people, but every other week they've been meeting on Sundays, and it's primarily Israelis, but they really do want American Jews to be out there as well. And we've been taking pictures and sending them, and there's a group that's called Unacceptable that has been organizing these protests everywhere around the world. I mean, you have people in Australia, and you have people all over Europe, and you have people all over the United States. And so the Israelis have really been appreciative. And I send those pictures every week to my friends in Givatayim, and they say, thank you for being on the streets. Thank you for participating in this, because otherwise we don't know what's going to happen to our society. And so I think that that's really the message I would like to leave people with, is that what happens in Israel does have an impact on us. Israelis who believe in a liberal democracy really do want us in the streets, and we should be there writing letters, doing what we can. It's very, very important time.
So, as I predicted, we've gone over our half hour. Rabbi, is there anything that you want to end with, or have we covered the primary things that you wanted to communicate.
We could talk for a lot longer, but I really think we covered what I experienced and the message that I was hoping to get across, and I hope that people will be involved in this. As I think many people know here, I've been involved in Israeli society for a long time, having lived there for several years myself, and it's a place that's near and dear to my heart for many reasons, and I know it is for many of us here as well, and I do hope that we can work together and to understand that this is something that's beyond just the state of Israel, that this is a concern for Jews wherever we live.
Thank you, Rabbi. And what I would encourage, I hope we have more of these sessions because this is not going to go away in the near future. And I would encourage any of you that have questions of the Rabbi or want to hear more about her experiences to approach her afterwards or talk to her in the weeks to come. So thank you very much.
Thank you to David.